A sprawling European forest that hides a destructive force.
This is clearly part of something very, very big and very, very dangerous.
In the Pacific Northwest, pioneers and pilgrims at the forefront of an industrial revolution.
Less than a year after this incredible technological breakthrough, disaster struck.
A South African ghost town that was gripped by fever.
Something went wrong, and really rather fast.
And odd structures resting in the English countryside.
There's a link between them, but what is that link?
Decaying relics and ruins of lost worlds. Forged through years of toil, they're now haunted by the past. Their extraordinary secrets are waiting to be revealed. In a remote corner of northwest Poland, just 100 miles away from the German border, dense woodland conceals a complex of ominous-looking structures.
Here we are in Europe, in the middle of rural Poland, surrounded by these beautiful pine trees. Suddenly, tucked away, something catches your eye. Man's been here before, and actually, he's made quite an effort to disguise what he's done.
You're not just in a wood, you're inside a very old and very well-protected facility that's all around you.
In a way, it sort of feels like you've stumbled on some kind of dystopian hobbit town. You get all these doorways covered with soil, leading to something that's hidden in the ground.
Whatever its origins, this place has been removed from local maps of the area. The question is, why?
Somebody built something very, very strong and then put a lot of earth over it to protect it from something very, very dangerous.
You also have some kind of ventilation system because you can see these grates for air intakes or exhaust.
So, who built this strange place, and what is concealed inside? From its very earliest days, this eerie underground site has been surrounded by mystery. Polish archaeologist Gregor Kyriakis has spent years trying to unravel its secrets.
The site was known, at least from the beginning of 1990s, to Polish citizens, but also to some historians which started to be interested at this place. But nobody before me did here any archaeological survey.
Recent declassified documents reveal that construction here began in 1966, a time when East and West were locked in a tense military standoff. There was the constant threat of all-out war.
The Soviet Union was intensely paranoid throughout the Cold War, and they were very worried about some kind of an attack from Europe.
To counter the perceived threat, the Soviets maintained a presence in all of their puppet communist states.
Polish army was obliged to build those facilities based on the plans that were supplied by Soviet Union. Polish soldiers did not have a clue what they were building. In fact, they were told that they are building communication center for Soviet troops.
The idea that the Soviets would have a communications base in Poland is very straightforward. It's a great cover.
And due to security reasons, every separate construction group had access only to a small part of the facility. So they could not gain an idea of the whole compound.
This is the Podborsko Cold War bunker, part of a vast network of secret underground military installations. If it had ever been called into action, it would have posed a grave danger to all of mankind.
The code name of the site was 3001, and we are standing just beside the monolith bunker. Those doors have to be kept closed because of the very specific environment that had to be created inside the bunker.
When you see the size of the door, you imagine the space inside must be pretty large.
It's only by venturing deeper that the true nature of the complex is finally revealed.
Looking at the bits left behind, and that's all we've got to go on, clearly there was something very, very sensitive being stored here. There's barriers, there's atmospherically sealed areas so that nothing can get in, but more importantly, nothing can get out. And this leads you to believe that there was radioactive material here.
So Aya says it is likely that these facilities were built to store RN-24 or RN-28 tactical nuclear weapons ready to be dropped from Soviet fighter bombers onto NATO forces fighting in Europe.
During the late 1960s, the USSR realized that if it was attacked, it wouldn't be able to get its nuclear arsenal to Poland quickly enough. So it hatched a plan to house atomic warheads at locations throughout its satellite states.
They didn't want the Allies to know where it was, or even the Polish people to know where it was. It might leak out. So they built these carefully hidden, highly secretive underground bunkers.
At sites like this, 500 kiloton warheads were stored that were 30 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The Soviets didn't say that they had nuclear weapons in Poland. They told the outside world that they didn't. The Soviets gave a false answer for operational reasons.
For more than 2 decades, the Polish people were kept in the dark about what was being stockpiled on their soil. Clues inside tell us that deadly weapons here had the potential to blow at any moment.
We are standing now at the main maneuvering hall, which was used for moving of the warhead. At the right side, we have rooms that were used for the storage of nuclear warheads.
The equipment here, the pressure gauges and the sensors are all signs that specific environmental conditions had to be maintained.
Military-grade plutonium is very prone to corrosion, so all the moisture from the air had to be removed, and therefore we'll have dehumidifiers and a hygrometer, which measured the humidity of the air.
State-of-the-art nuclear weapons are sensitive things. And when things go wrong, they go catastrophically wrong. So temperature control, humidity control, very, very important, particularly if you're trying to remain secret.
However, it seems that by trying to cover their tracks, the Red Army made a fatal error.
At the end of 1969, those bases were finished and handed over to Soviet troops. Soviet troops started to work on the camouflage of the site, but they made few mistakes.
So the Soviets start to plant spruce trees around their installation. But in Poland, the local forest is birch. And in the autumn, the leaves fall off. All you're left with is these thin white stems and yellow leaves on the ground.
During the Cold War, the Americans kept a very close watch on the Soviets using satellite photography. So they're looking for human activity.
American satellites could see right past those spruce trees, and they knew there was something going on.
CIA reports now reveal that the US intelligence agency identified 23 similar installations spread right across the Eastern Bloc. Even with this intelligence, Western Europe was still powerless to prevent the Soviet warheads being fired. If a full-scale war had broken out, total annihilation would have been inevitable.
If the war happened, trucks from this base would be loaded with warheads, and then they would move to those shelters and wait for the further orders.
For more than 2 decades after the bunkers were built, the world lived with the threat of a nuclear war hanging over it. It was only after the Soviet Union began to crumble in the late 1980s that mankind was able to breathe a little easier.
In 1991, Soviet troops were withdrawn from this facility, and it was officially handed over to Polish Navy.
And with the Red Army at last gone, the truth about the abandoned bunkers was finally revealed.
After the Cold War, there was a treaty which required the Soviets to open some of their facilities for inspection. As part of that process, they had to admit that some of their facilities in Poland had nuclear weapons in them.
Following the departure of the Soviet army, similar bunkers in the Polish countryside were vandalized, and one was actually converted into a prison. But this site is preserved as a chilling reminder of how close the world once came to nuclear destruction.
To be allowed to see all those structures, to walk through the corridors of this bunker is like to have this power to travel back in time. Every time I pass the doors of this building, I have this feeling like Russian troops have withdrawn just yesterday.
In the heart of America's Pacific Northwest, 15 miles south of Portland, Oregon, there's a curious set of structures by a large river.
You look around at this site and you see industrial spheres, chimneys. Clearly there was a lot going on here.
What this looks like is an empty shell of an industrial site. There are windows broken, there's rain pouring through the roof. It's a ghost site.
The many abandoned buildings from different ages reveal that this place has grown and transformed over time.
At the center are older ruins that don't seem to fit with the rest of the site. Clearly, this has been used for centuries, but for a variety of different purposes.
You get the sense that at one point this was just teeming with activity, from machines in activation and people and hustle and bustle.
So how are those structures connected? And why did this site change so much through the years?
The proximity of the water is clearly a very important part of this site's history, and some of the buildings now look as if they've even been destroyed by the power of that very same water.
Whatever went on here, the river is clearly the key.
This was once the beating heart of Oregon City's industrial district. Over its 150-year history, this place has had many different identities. It has evolved as the needs of industry changed. But during that time, there's been one constant, spectacular feature.
So what we're looking at is the second largest waterfall by volume in the United States. There is an enormous amount of potential power here.
So how would this extraordinary place manage to harness the raw power of the mighty river? In Clackamas County, Oregon, a curious set of structures dominates the area. But most of the remains here provide perfect clues about the most recent use of the site. It was for the production of an item with which we're all very familiar.
In more modern times, with the demand for paper, and given all the trees in the surrounding area, this became one of the heartlands for newspaper production.
In its final guise, this was a giant paper mill, supplying newsprint all across the West Coast, including to the Los Angeles Times. Local expert Don Scott has long been fascinated by its history.
So we're now inside paper machine number 4. This is where the actual paper making took place. This building would have been filled with people, buzzing with activity. The mill ran 24 hours a day.
It's known as a paper mill towards the latter end of its life, but decades before that, it had so many other different uses.
Hidden amongst the modern rusting ruins are things that are not from its recent past.
These stone blocks formed the foundation walls, so what you see is very little of what was originally here. It's got a long history dating all the way back to 1832.
The first people drawn to the water's formidable natural strength roamed these rugged lands for millennia.
The Native Americans realized the benefits of the area because of the falls. With the sheer drop at the end of them, fish stayed in one small reservoir, making it effectively a natural pantry.
So for many generations, the Native American peoples were in harmony with nature, taking fish from the river. And then when the white Europeans arrived, things started to change.
As the last stop along the Oregon Trail, pioneers flocked to the region during the mid-19th century. What drew them here was the establishment of a settlement by a man who became known as the Father of Oregon.
When John McLaughlin arrived, he saw an entirely different opportunity in this area with the force of the waterfall, and this realization was the true start of industrialization in this area, which expanded rapidly outwards.
So the most impressive thing about Willamette Falls is the sheer power of the water coming over the falls. You can actually feel the roar as you're standing here, and as you're just completely covered with the spray, it is truly an impressive sight.
This is the location of the Willamette Falls sawmill, the very first commercial site to harness the power of water, and the reason Oregon City and this vast industrial district exist today. Before long, flour and woolen mills sprang up along the riverbank, and the whole area quickly became a thriving manufacturing center.
So this is clearly a site that's built up over time, and eventually it's going to become quite a sprawling edifice. But it all started on the west bank of the river, and then eventually we'll incorporate the other bank.
But it was another structure, one yet to be built, that would make an even bigger contribution to Oregon's history.
By the end of the 19th century, the site had been used for all sorts of industrial applications, but it was on the cusp of being used for something even more radical that would affect not only the area, but the wider United States.
It's the crumbling concrete blocks and rusting pipes near the original sawmill that hint at the pioneering achievements here.
A power plant was built to harness the flow of water, and it was used to spin turbines.
So this is the location of the original Station A. What we're seeing here is the outflow of the water which would have passed by the dynamos, which were used to generate the electricity.
Using water to produce electrical energy was nothing new. So what was so special about the power produced here? And how would it change America forever?
The power potential here is obviously immense. You're talking about hundreds of tons of water flowing over the falls every minute. And imagine someone coming 100 years ago and wanting to harness that power, but knowing the danger. How are they going to do it?
In 1889, hydroelectric energy had already been in use for 7 years. But transferring it over long distances hadn't yet been possible. At this time, much of America was still lit by candles and gaslight. And if that could be achieved, it would be a game changer.
Copper lines were strung from the power plant about 14 miles to downtown Portland. When the switch was thrown, history was made, the first long-distance power transmission in the United States.
What they did was groundbreaking. This completely transformed Portland. It made it a modern city.
But within a few months, water was to have a very different effect.
Less than a year after this incredible technological breakthrough, disaster struck. A storm hit, and the floodwaters of the rivers tore through the building, effectively bulldozing it.
So the buildings that would have been originally here were completely washed away in the flood of 1890.
This is the danger when you're trying to harness the power of Mother Nature. When it goes wrong, it goes very, very wrong.
I can't imagine the level of devastation after having achieved this amazing thing of transmitting energy and electricity over long distances, to have that completely wiped out within a few months.
Following the violent storm, repairs to the power station quickly got underway. And soon it was powering what would be the final phase in the development of this industrial heartland. A thriving paper-making industry emerged that was among the first in the country to use machines operated by electricity. Over time, older buildings made way for modern paper-making facilities, the derelict remains of which line the water's edge today. At its height, the factories provided vital jobs for around 2,000 workers, but the manufacture of paper also came with a heavy price.
The early days of papermaking was very toxic. Sadly, a lot of that was dumped into the river in the late 60s, which virtually killed the fish population.
In time, the mills cleaned up their act and later led the way with recycled products. But the writing was already on the wall.
In the end, the spiraling costs of keeping up with the ever more severe environmental legislation and the stiff competition coming from cheaper products abroad meant that the paper mill couldn't keep up and closed.
So the site represents really the history of America. It tells the entire story from pre-white settlement to current times, and it really is the story of America told in one single place.
With almost 200 years' worth of industrial development still visible here, this has been a place of almost constant change. And today, with work underway on plans to redevelop the site, there's still plenty of life here yet.
People have always used the area for what struck them as important at the time. And in today's age, the falls are now merely appreciated for their beauty.
In the Mpumalanga province of South Africa, nestled at the foot of a mountainous valley, is a set of structures with an incredible story to tell.
When you first sort of look at it, it's clearly some sort of abandoned town, but it's not like some small stage post town in the middle of the outback.
There's a main street running through the middle. There's houses, hotels, bars, church, but it's not just one street. This place is utterly sprawling.
We're way out in the remote countryside, so there must have been a good reason for all these people to move here, some incentive to get people to settle these hills.
Lining the ridge above are rundown buildings constructed in a different style. Perhaps these provide a clue as to why a community somehow grew in this unforgiving terrain.
Around this place is some pretty industrial-looking machinery, and that coupled with all the numerous buildings, this was clearly designed for processing something, but what that was is not so clear.
We've even got up in the hills, you've actually got what looks like some sort of abandoned tram line. And so there was clearly something very important that they wanted to move around.
But what exactly was being transported? And how does it connect to the eerie, preserved houses and empty streets below?
It was clearly in its day a booming town, but something went wrong, and really rather fast.
Was there a really dramatic thing that happened that killed off everyone? Why is there nobody there?
It's a stunningly beautiful landscape, but when you look at it in this remote area, you do wonder, aside from the natural beauty, why would somebody want to live out here? What would their livelihood be?
In the late 1800s, this was a place of discovery, a new frontier, which in time would be gripped by fever, tainted by greed, and touched by war.
19th century South Africa was all about opportunity and exploitation. So although this place was in the middle of a vast and empty landscape, people flocked here in their thousands from every corner of the globe.
But what valuable prize first drew people here, and why did they leave so suddenly? The answer is to be found buried deep in the ground and in the streams and rivers of the country.
There's not really actually clues in the landscape that there's lots and lots of mineral wealth there. So in a sense, you have to be kind of looking for it.
In 1886, fortune seekers began to descend on the African continent, kickstarting one of the biggest land grabs in history. But a decade earlier, the region had been the setting for South Africa's first gold rush, and the story of how it was discovered is the stuff of legend.
Back in 1873, there was a prospector who was known as Wheelbarrow Patterson because he had brought his gear all the way from the coast, literally in a wheelbarrow, over 1,000 miles.
Patterson did strike it lucky in one small stream, but he kept this finding to himself. He didn't report it. But he could only keep it secret for so long.
But pretty soon the word got out, and miners from all over began flooding into the area.
Almost overnight, a makeshift camp sprang up. Joseph Mashego is an expert on the history of mining in this area.
When prospectors arrived here, there were no proper structures, so they used tents as accommodation.
Within months, 1,500 miners were working around 4,000 claims, all determined to find the most precious of metals. Before long, the ramshackle parade of canvas tents was replaced by buildings with iron roofs.
In its heyday, this was ground zero for the great South African gold rush.
This is the ghost town of Pilgrim's Rest, and these are the rivers of gold that built it.
Very, very quickly, Pilgrim's Rest became a classic boom town, a gold rush town. And the population exploded. You had saloons and everything else associated with young men with too much money.
In less than a decade, gold worth hundreds of millions of dollars today was drawn from the riverbed.
Now, when the prospectors arrived here, they had no machines, they had no chemicals. Now, how they separated the gold, they only use water.
So one of the classic ways of exploring for gold is looking in rivers, because rivers erode the landscape and concentrate heavy things like gold in them.
The kind of gold that they were finding here is what you call alluvial gold. It means gold that's been washed out of the big ore veins in the mountains.
The reward was unimaginable wealth. But the search for gold also came with a big downside.
Wherever there's been a gold rush, it has attracted adventurers, often reckless types. But they're willing to gamble a lot and live through a lot of hardship for this chance to literally strike it rich.
I mean, during such a gold rush, the environment is electric, but it's also dangerous. People would fall into despair if their particular plot was barren. They may even be driven to suicide. It was that sort of crazy environment.
Now they suffered a lot. Then they were alcoholic. It's how they misused their money. Only 5% got rich and 95% were poor.
Yet, trouble of a different kind was brewing. In time, gold from Pilgrim's Rest was to become involved in a bloody conflict, one that would result in the deaths of thousands.
At Pilgrim's Rest, the advent of the Boer War meant the mining industry pretty much shut down.
The Second Boer War began in 1899, and it was fought between the British Empire and two Boer states, Orange Free State and the South African Republic. The Boers were of Dutch descent, and they were fighting for independence from British colonial rule. Outmanned and outgunned, the Boers were forced into retreat. But it was the gold from Pilgrim's Rest that provided them a lifeline.
The Boers took over the area and a lot of the miners were forced to leave.
The Boer army desperately needed to raise money. Using gold from the mines, a makeshift mint was hastily assembled. 530 so-called Pilgrim's Rest gold coins were struck. But before they could be used, the Boers were forced to surrender.
But this was just the beginning. What was in store for Pilgrim's Rest was so much bigger than anyone could have ever imagined.
Hunger for gold would eventually drive technological innovation. Although the mine's most productive days were still ahead of it, the dreams of many were left in tatters.
Some of the different operations mining for gold, they merged and they built a much more industrialized mining operation that kind of took the place of a lot of small groups out there with their picks and shovels.
That starts to explain the big machinery, it starts to explain the sort of rock crushing equipment.
So once you begin this mechanized mining operation, you need a lot of power to run it.
The solution to this was the Belvedere hydroelectric power plant. And this became the largest, at its time, hydroelectric power plant in the Southern Hemisphere.
We are sitting right at the bottom of the Blythe River Canyon, where the Belvedere power station is established. We had electricity before England and France when they were still using gas.
This impressive feat of engineering pumped out over 2,000 kilowatts of energy. Armed now with a constant, reliable supply of power, production at the mines stepped up a gear.
The real wealth of this area could finally be realized. This tram line took the mining of this area up to a whole new level. It meant that huge amounts of iron ore could be transported at one time, and with it, the gold that's hidden within.
The main boom period for this mine actually was 1913, 1914.
They were producing 112,000 ounces of gold, leading to a profit of 550,000 rand, which you might not think is that much money, but in those days, it was an awful lot.
But for Pilgrim's Rest, the industrial mining that brought such prosperity was also the cause of its demise. With the land stripped of its worth, gold production steadily declined, and the people began to leave the town.
Some amount of mining limped along until the 1970s, and then they shut down for good. But the town didn't completely disappear, as is so often the case.
In 1986, the settlement, now largely deserted, was declared a national monument. A South African boomtown built on gold, now preserved for future generations.
People love to see these dramatic moments in history, and there's nothing more dramatic than the idea of a boomtown and gold miners and all that romance. And you can still see a little bit of it when you visit a place like Pilgrim's Rest.
In southwest England, in the county of Somerset, relics of a long-gone era are hidden amongst the rolling hills and green pastures.
So here we are in the beautiful English countryside, surrounded by fields, miles from anywhere. and it looks like nothing has ever changed.
You see this weird sort of train of trees. As you delve further through the trees, you actually come to a waterway that leads to an arch, leading somehow into the hill.
The tunnel's been barred. You can't get into it. It's dark, so you can't see what's down it. What was the purpose of this? What is it doing here, and where does it lead?
A look at the surrounding terrain reveals other strange constructions.
So moving away from this sort of mysterious tunnel, all of a sudden you start to come across some other quite quirky things.
Tucked in amongst the undergrowth, find these brutal, heavy, robust concrete structures, very deliberately placed, but completely at odds with the surrounding.
These appear to be from a different era entirely.
So here we have this tunnel on one hand, but then we have these much later concrete structures scattered around the countryside. There's a link between them, but what is that link?
What does all this have to do with the deadliest conflict in history and a revolution that changed the world? Nestled in the English countryside is a set of mysterious structures that began life in the early 1800s. It was a time when Britain was at the center of the Industrial Revolution.
In the 19th century, it's a time of opportunity. We're moving from this very agricultural, rural base to a manufacturing setup, and there is fortunes to be made.
In this period, the demand for resources was huge and growing daily. But it wasn't just about how much you could get, it was about how fast you could get it to where it needed to be.
The solution was a series of interconnecting canals to link the country's main rivers.
The canal system in the UK really kicked things off. Suddenly, there was a way to transport these high-bulk, low-value materials around the country, export them around the world. And the canals made that transportation possible.
By the early 1800s, more than 2,000 miles of canals had been completed. David Viner is an expert on the UK's pioneering canal network.
OK, so we just arrived at a place called Crimson Hill, which is about halfway along the line of the old canal that ran from Creech, just outside Taunton, to Chard. And this was a serious bit of geography they had to contend with.
If you look at the site from the air, you can see the canal, just follow that line of trees, and it goes pretty flat for a while, but then you get to this base of a significant hill, and that's a real obstacle.
And there's no easy way round this. So the engineering solution, at a cost, is to go through.
This is the Crimson Hill Canal Tunnel.
I'm just coming to the entrance of the tunnel. The first time I've been here, so it's quite exciting. It's fenced off to stop intruders. So unlock the door.
Construction of this 13-mile-long canal began in 1835. It was the 5,400-foot tunnel that presented the biggest engineering challenge.
They dug down from the top of the hill and then dug out towards each side. And they did this one first, because if they couldn't overcome this obstacle, then the whole project will have fallen apart.
So we're travelling through the Crimson Tunnel now. I don't know when the last time somebody came through, because it's normally gated off. This is really quite exciting. It is in very good condition. Water dripping through in places.
But the clock was ticking. A brand new invention came along to threaten the future of Britain's waterways.
So in the case of the Chard Canal, it was always at a disadvantage. It was built late on in the canal period, right at the end of the canal period. By the 1840s, the railways were coming. And the advantage of the railways is that they were much faster and they could carry a lot more freight.
By the middle of the century, there were more than 6,000 miles of railway track in Britain, connecting more of the country than ever before. Steam-powered locomotives were quicker and more cost-effective. For the nation's canals, the death knell had been sounded.
In the end, canals couldn't really compete. It became cheaper to lay down railway lines than to dig canals.
After only 2 decades in operation, the Chard Canal was abandoned. But that was not the end of its story.
After the heydays of the canal, the landscape just fell back into its rural farming role. But these brutalist structures that follow the line of the canal mean that something else happened.
70 years after the last barge transported its goods, the dangers of the 20th century's bloodiest conflict saw the canal reopened and repurposed.
Following the evacuation at Dunkirk in the Second World War, Britain had to gear up to face one of its greatest existential threats to it ever, the possibility of a German invasion. Defenses had to be prepared.
But this is not the coast, so why build defenses here?
Out of nowhere, there's this great concrete structure here, which is a pillbox, part of a Second World War defensive line. And it's in an absolutely commanding position, and there's another one over there, so they could control the line of fire in 2 different directions.
This is the Taunton Stop Line, a continuous 48-mile anti-tank structure that runs between the Bristol and English channels. It was to form a crucial part of the nation's defenses should Germany have invaded.
When they were designing this defensive line, they wanted, as far as possible, to take advantage of the natural obstacles. So rivers, waterways like canals, railway embankments, or anything that proved an obstacle.
In just a matter of months, 18,000 pillboxes and lines of so-called dragon's teeth were constructed at vital positions around the UK. Here, they were intended to defend the crucial southwest corridor. Fortunately, the brave men stationed inside them were never called into action.
They did the best they could with the time they had and the materials on hand. But in the end, these fortifications were not going to stop a determined enemy for very long. If you were stuck in one of these pillboxes, it was likely going to be your last stand.
By 1945, with the threat of invasion long gone and Nazi Germany beaten, the defenses became redundant, and they quickly fell into disrepair.
This is not state-of-the-art defensive engineering, but what it is a very quick, a very cheap solution. It gives heart to the population that they're being looked after, that they're being protected.
Today, they still survive as a visible reminder of Britain's and Europe's bitter struggle against tyranny. Now they are abandoned, crumbling ruins. Many remind us of dark times, but some were once beacons of hope and progress, lasting testimonies to human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.